Welcome to PERFPOD, your go-to podcast for everything related to performance management. Whether you're a student or a seasoned professional, you'll find valuable insights and updates here. PERFPOD episodes will be short, snappy, and are particularly targeted at ACCA students studying for performance management or advanced performance management exams. They'll include technical content, exam techniques, and real-world applications, giving you the best chance to pass these two tricky exams. I'm your host, Richard Guyver, also known as the Dentist Accountant. In today's podcast, we're not going to look at technical content, we're going to look at exam technique. Exam technique is one of those areas which is definitely one of the key factors that leads to people not being successful in their exams. So the title of this episode is Don't Be a Drifter, and it applies to performance management and APM, but probably more so APM this one, where it's a critical thing to consider. So what do I mean by a drifter? Now, if anyone's ever flown a plane or sailed a boat or trekked across a bit of land where there's no visual signs, for example, during a whiteout, hopefully you'd use a compass. Now, I've done a fair amount of hiking in places like Dartmoor in the UK, and it's amazing how disorientating it can be if I can't see any landmarks. But by trusting and following a compass, I end up getting to the right destination. But I know that if I didn't have that compass, I would drift off course and getting further and further away from where I'm meant to be as I progress. And a very similar thing happens in the exam. I've observed there are three types of people. There's those who understand and answer the question. There's those who don't answer the question, either because they don't understand it or maybe haven't read it properly. And then there are the drifters. Today we're going to be talking about the drifters. So a drifter, it's a term that would be defined as someone who understands the question, and their first point they make is correct and scores marks. The second point is okay, it scores marks, but maybe isn't quite as good as the first point. But by the third point they're not answering the question, they don't get any marks, and the fourth and fifth points they make are miles off. And what I think is happening in this scenario is subsequent answers are building on the previous answer, not from the question. And as they do that, they get further and further away from the intent of the question. So if that's what a drifter is, how do we prevent being a drifter? I think there's two key stages. So the first is to plan your answers. Now, I certainly wouldn't recommend wasting loads of time planning answers, but it is important to identify what the question is asking and noting down the key points that you intend to make and score marks with in your answer. And once you've got that plan, the next step is a technique I use, and it's all about controlling the voices in your head. Now, if you don't think you have voices in your head, ask yourself who told you that. And then also, how did you ask yourself that question? I'll give an example. Now, this is an example from APM. There's a question in some of the study texts called Luvij. Part A is a 12-mark question. And the question asks, respond to the board's request for working on the following area, external information, 12 marks. And it's typical in APM that the question doesn't give much away. And that's where we need to find what's called the embedded requirement. Now, if you're studying PM at this stage, don't worry too much about this, but in APM it's essential that you get the embedded requirement. So what we then do is we look at the exhibits and we find what is really the real question embedded somewhere in the exhibits. And if we look through, we find this comment. As a result of these concerns, the board have asked your assistance with an explanation of the factors which might limit the usefulness of external information currently used by Luvij, and how the use of a unified corporate database could help overcome these limitations. Now, I want you to really notice there was an and in the middle, so there's two parts to that question. And again, don't worry too much about the technical content here because we're talking about exam technique. So this is a 12 marker, and first we need to explain the factors which might limit the usefulness of external information currently used, and then secondly, how the use of a unified corporate database could help overcome these limitations. So in my plan, I would write the title of my response as Factors Limiting the Usefulness of Current Information. I won't make a long title, but I want a title that's going to help me understand and remember what the question's asking. And I'm aware from the structure of that question that for each point I make, there's probably 2 marks, one for the limitation and the second for how the unified corporate database might help. Now, when studying for APM, one of the requirements in APM is to be able to describe the qualities of good information. And there's a mnemonic that can be used, and the mnemonic is the word accurate, ACCURATE, obviously with each letter representing one of the features of good information. From memory, it's possibly also in the syllabus for strategic business leader. And each letter stands for: A is for accurate, C is complete, C is cost beneficial, U is user targeted, R is relevant, A is authoritative, T is timely, and E is easy to use. Again, don't worry if not studied, but there are 8 factors, and this is a 12-mark question with 2 marks for each part, so I probably need 6. And what I would then do is use information in the question to choose the 6 best ones out of that 8, and each one of those would be my subheading, and that would be my essay plan. i.e. there'd be the title, factors limiting usefulness of current information, and then the 6 subheadings taken from that mnemonic accurate. And then I would copy and paste that into my answer area. Now, there is an interesting debate to be had another time on whether to aim for full marks or not, but that is a separate issue, and on this occasion I'll assume we're going to go for full marks. So in my answer, I would take one of the subheadings. Let's take cost effective as an example. So what I would do is get the voices in my head to restate the question. So my title at the moment is Factors Limiting the Usefulness of Current Information, but now the voices in my head are going to tell me the new question is: how is cost effectiveness of information a limitation to Luvij? And then I would write a sentence or 2 on that. And then I'd get the voices in my head to help me again, and they would ask me, how would using a unified database improve the cost effectiveness of the information? And then I'd write my answer on that part. And then I reset. So let's say my next subheading is timely. So I'd run through exactly the same process. The voices in my head would restate the question, once again turning it from factors limiting usefulness of current information to how is timeliness of this information a limitation to Luvij? And then I'd write 1 or 2 sentences on that. And then that voices in my head again would help by saying, how would a unified database improve the timeliness of the information? And then I'd write out my answer. And I hope you can see by doing that I'm avoiding drift, because each time I reset back to the question asked, and each time I've restated it specifically to the point I'm going to make, or rather the voices in my head have restated it, and that vastly increases the chances of me answering the actual question that's being asked. Now obviously I'm acting a bit in jest when I'm talking about voices in my head, but it is backed up by psychology and neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, because what we're doing with a technique like this, like I've explained with voices in my head, is we're getting our conscious mind to instruct our subconscious mind to help us get to where we want to be. So in summary, today we've looked at an exam technique which is to help counteract the issue which I call drift, or to prevent someone being a drifter, and it's especially useful in APM and to a lesser extent in PM. So thanks for tuning in to PERFPOD. I hope you found this episode informative. As always, feedback in the comments would be great, and obviously we'll focus on exam techniques, so that perhaps if there are any other concerns, your challenges you're having in an exam, perhaps put those in the feedback, and we'll look to see if there's any exam techniques we can find to help with those. And as always, please share with colleagues who you think might find this useful. And until next time, this is PERFPOD signing off.